Welcome to Bridging the Gap, Repairing Relationships for Stronger Community Change. My name is Lisa Attygalle, and I'm the Consulting Director of Community Engagement with the Tamarack Institute. We're excited today to discuss how to engage your community when they may be hesitant to engage, and how to build equitable relationships with the communities your work impacts. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Liz Weaver, who's the co-CEO of Tamarack and strategic lead for the Tamarack Learning Center. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, Lisa, and hello to everybody else on the line. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm excited for this webinar. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Tamarack. So if you're unfamiliar with the Tamarack Institute, there's a few different ways that our work supports community building and poverty reduction efforts. And so you can see on this slide, the work that Lisa and I are engaged in falls largely in the Learning Center circle. And so the Learning Center really looks at 5 interconnected practices for community change, collective impact, community engagement, which we're focused on today, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. And we in the Learning Center scan worldwide and look at emerging practices and try to share them with you in a way that helps your work become even more impactful. Our colleagues in Vibrant Communities are really looking at supporting cities and local leaders to both reduce poverty and deepen community. So that's the work of Tamarack in a nutshell. The reason why I'm excited to join this call, Lisa, is that a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper on turf, trust, and collaboration. And so the themes of community engagement and trust are really woven together. How do we build trust? How do we repair when trust is lost? What are some of the elements? And how does that lead to really strong engagement practices and bridge that gap when the gap emerges?
Yeah, it's this question of how do we engage the community when they're hesitant to engage is actually one that I'm asked all the time. And so that's really why we wanted to explore this topic on this webinar today. And most of you are here today and you're serving in a role where you're hoping to work with the community. And from your perspective, you may experience a number of things. You might experience, as a practitioner, designing consultation events or trying to work with different groups and finding that, people don't show up. You get the same 10 people, or that people show up, but they might show up, ready for conflict or angered about things that may have happened in the past. Or they may, kind of grab the microphone and want to share some things on their mind that might be different than the agenda that you've put forward. And so some of these questions around, how to manage that and what are the things we need to change in our mindset when we're walking into situations where the community may be hesitant. And I think one of the things to really understand is that we need to look at what this looks like from the community member's perspective. Typically, if you're experiencing some of those things, there's some underlying reasons why. There may have been negative past experiences. Maybe they didn't feel respected in how they were engaged previously. They didn't feel listened to. Maybe they, put in a lot of time, but then didn't see their thoughts and perspectives reflected in the end outcome. And maybe they, put in a lot of time and then never heard back and didn't feel respected that way. Maybe they feel over-consulted. Maybe if they've been responding with the same feedback time and time again and nothing seems to change, they'll stop showing up. Maybe they don't see the benefit of spending their time in that way. And this is often the case when we see, community engagement done like it's an afterthought or like it's a checkbox in a list of things that need to be done, as opposed to the reason why we're engaging. Like, what is the outcome and how is that process of engaging? How is it absolutely pivotal to the outcomes that you're seeking? Liz, what are your thoughts on this hesitance to engage?
You know, sometimes you might see people show up at your event and they want to engage, but they, you know, what they want to engage on might not be the topic that you're presenting, but they haven't seen any other opportunities to engage. And so your activity presents the opportunity for them to engage. And so then they divert the conversation and really wanting to talk about what they want to talk about. And so it's also thinking about what's the right messaging around your engagement process and what's it focused on. And really, I think thinking about that even as you begin to design your engagement strategy.
Mm-hmm. Our team had a bit of an aha moment in some recent work with the Winnipeg Boldness Project. And so that's working with a community, the Point Douglas community in Winnipeg, around increasing the well-being of that community. And one of the aha moments was that it seems that often the posture of some of the traditional consultation and traditional engagement practices seem to be in conflict with how people want to be engaged. So this kind of aha around people often engage in a way where they're separating the personal and professional. You know, they're wanting to avoid conflict. They're really kind of putting on this practitioner hat. And the community, on the other hand, really wants to know that you care. They want to develop relationships. They want to know that you're keenly interested. They want to build trust. They want to kind of approach it as a family would, you know, and get into some of those tough discussions that may involve conflict, but with an understanding that there would be interest in resolution at the same time. And so that was kind of a huge aha moment for our team that I found really interesting. And it's one of those things that make you think, okay, what is my mindset and what kind of role am I playing as I walk into wanting to engage the community?
Mm-hmm.
Another story I just thought I would share as a kind of lens for the remainder of our conversation today is a story about Poverty Solutions Halifax. And so this is a group that had several goals. They wanted to raise the public awareness around poverty. They wanted to engage the community around a shared vision. They wanted to mobilize the community to identify local needs and then prioritize those solutions. And they also wanted to build trust to support that collective action. And this project, you know, when you look at the community engagement strategy, it's a really comprehensive strategy. There were so many mechanisms in place for authentic engagement. There's, you know, people that were deemed the community conscience, and these are advocates and agencies and service providers who work with people with lived experience. There's also experts by experience, and these are people with lived experience who are included on all committees. They had a business alliance, they had advisory committees. The engagement techniques included, you know, everything from open houses and public meetings to workshops to, you know, creative things like writing and art, online surveys. And this was so comprehensive. And the thing, it even included, you know, a stat like 38% of people involved had lived experience. And so there's a lot to celebrate in this project. But the group was also, they got feedback that it wasn't representative of the entire community. There was weak representative from Indigenous community members, from the African Nova Scotian community members, from rural community members, and some feedback that the time frame of the project, which was 3 months for the main engagement portion, was just too short and it wasn't conducive to building trust and relationships. And what I found was so helpful in this example is that Poverty Solutions Halifax had this posture of, you're right, you know, they acknowledged the pitfalls, they acknowledged the things that they would do differently next time, and then they worked together with the community to identify what they'd want to do differently next time, and included recommendations like wanting to make sure that decision making is based on acceptance, wanting to strengthen the partnerships that they have with these groups that were underrepresented, really be more transparent about the decision making processes, building relationships before trying to engage. And my favorite, making sure that all meetings include some sort of capacity building or some sort of reciprocity. The benefit of being there needs to be profound. And so I love this example, and we'll mention this again as we talk through some of the ideas we have about how to repair relationships. But I think Poverty Solutions Halifax is such a great example of somebody who's open to feedback and understanding that it will never be perfect and that continual improvement is necessary in all of this work. So we want to understand, as we ask these questions about what's going on in your own work, really take some time to say, why do you want to engage? It can't be a checkbox. It can't be an afterthought. But your why of why you want to engage needs to be something you spend significant time on, because that will affect everything else. It will affect the design of your process, because process is just as important as those outcomes, and really the outcomes will be intrinsically connected to that process. It involves who you engage, how you design your evaluation. It relates to everything. And so your why also needs to be mutually beneficial to the community. And so that's one of the things that we often see as an underlying reason, is that there's not this mutual benefit as it relates to why you're engaging the community. And so then we ask the question of, what do we need to do differently? Large-scale social change is incremental, and authentic community engagement needs to go beyond consultation. And so how can we listen? How can we adapt? And how do we follow the community's lead, rather than solely engaging the community in our vision or our goals for the project? And so we've developed, as we thought about this, we've developed these 7 guiding ideas, and we're going to jump into each of these ideas, talk about why we think these are important things to consider as you're wanting to bridge this gap and repair relationships with community groups. And for each one, we'll talk a little bit about it, and also talk about some strategies or tools that we found helpful in our work.
Lisa, when we think about the why as well and what we need to do differently, what's interesting is as we begin to define the why, we're starting to also identify some critical success factors, right? Mm-hmm. And those can be things that we then evaluate at the end of the engagement. So if the why is to develop relationships, for example, before we go into that guiding idea, we can then come to the end of it, and we can at the beginning say, okay, we want to develop X number of relationships with X number of partners. And then when we come to the end of our engagement, were we successful at developing those relationships? So the why is actually can be very instrumental in also the evaluation process of building relationships and of really engaging folks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the first guiding idea we have here is develop relationships. And so it is so important to understand the layers within the community. There's a report that was put out by the Vitalist Health Foundation called Pre-Engagement. And Duncan will actually put this link in the chat box, as well as it will be shared out tomorrow with the rest of the materials. But this concept of pre-engagement is really interesting and really important. It says we need to do a number of things before we're looking to get something from the community. You need to build those relationships, and you need to take time to really care about the community. And so in this strategy that they have on pre-engagement, it includes the first step as seeking to understand those layers within the community. And that involves understanding the history of what's happened, understanding what prior engagement has happened. We were talking about consultation fatigue before, and the number of times the community is asked the same questions is often really high. And so going to the community and saying, hey, we're interested in exploring this topic. Have you talked about this before? Are other groups already working on it? How can you join up with those groups? How can you get the data from those other consultations and saying, okay, now what? Maybe we can actually switch our attention to taking this already existing data forward. And so forming those relationships in order to ask those questions is really important. establishing connections with all of the different groups to ensure that representation, going out of your way. What does it look like to show up, you know, at the different agencies and say, hey, like, here I am, how can we work together? Really, the second step of the pre-engagement report is understanding a range of perspectives. And then third, to identify the strategies that support the community preferences. And so really developing these relationships to ensure that you're designing engagement processes that actually align with the community. And so here are 5 ideas that can help with this. So it can be helpful to start with trusted partners. So you likely have some existing relationships. Start with conversations with them and then get them to help connect you in with others. Don't end with the people you already know. That can lead to always talking to the usual suspects and getting the same perspectives. But then it can go with a kind of snowball recruitment process. You know, you ask people that you know to say, hey, can you help bring people together on this? Because they are the ones with the trusted voice. Something that's really important is thinking about the value proposition for engagement and actually sitting down with community members and talking this through, saying, here's what we want to do. What would make it valuable to your community? What would be the difference maker? What would lead to people showing up? Going where they are, and again, building relationships before you need to engage. Anything to add there, Liz?
No, I think it's a great list. I think, you know, just moving on from the idea of starting with trusted partners is the second big idea that we have, or the second guiding idea, and this notion of building trust, right? And so part of the process of building trust, as Lisa said, you actually want to look back in your community and say, are there experiences that have actually created turn? And then how do we navigate those experiences as we try to move forward and build effective engagement processes? Stephen Covey is famous for saying that collaboration grows at the speed of trust. And so it is really important to pay attention to trust. And you know what was interesting in the slides that you just showed, Lisa, was this notion that we can't assume that trust is there immediately. We have to invest in a trust account, right? And really look at that kind of what has happened in the past and what can we leverage going forward. What's interesting, and something that I found out as I was doing research about trust and collaboration, is the fact that trust sits within our brain, right? It's in our prefrontal cortex. And you know, as we're thinking about our relationships with others, we're kind of going through our brain and thinking about these things. Okay, so my status. Do people think that I have the right status to convene this meeting? So how important am I to other people? How important are the other people to me? So we do a thing around status. We look at certainty, and so certainty is the ability to predict the future, and sometimes when we're engaging people, we might have an idea of what that looks like, but do other people have an idea? And so how do we play around with the certainty question, autonomy? So will we, if we're engaging someone about something, will we have the autonomy to move their ideas to the next step? Or do the people that we're engaging, do they perceive that we have that autonomy? And so some of the way that we build trust is that kind of reciprocity around autonomy, relatedness. Are we creating safe environments for folks to be able to share their perspectives? And then fairness. Is this going to be a fair exchange? Are we going to hear from everybody in the room? Or are we going to let certain people dominate the conversation and other people sit back? And so these are really important things to consider, because as we're engaging folks are considering these either explicitly or more implicitly in terms of their brain. The other thing that Stephen Covey tells us is that there are 13 ways that we can really build trust. And I think this is a helpful list. There's probably more than 13. There's probably other ones that you could add if we were to open up the phone lines. But it's helpful. It's a helpful starting point. And one is, you know, a couple of them are to talk straight, to be, to share with people the degree to which their their information, their engagement is going to be able to transform how you're thinking about things and how it's going to impact the consultation process or the engagement process. Delivering results, we're going to hear a little bit more about. Sometimes we have to do some of the hard pieces like confront reality, right? To if someone is dominating the conversation, how do we do that effectively? And we can do that by clarifying expectations. And then I think the final and most important one of this list of 13 is that we have to extend trust. We have to believe that the people that we're engaging are going to show up with their best selves, right? And to extend the trust to them and to develop a process and an engagement process that really does enable people to be the best that they can be in that process. And so building trust is not just one thing, it's looking at many things, but it's also about kind of considering how we build trust in our processes. And so I think that's helpful. We'll provide a link to the paper I wrote about building trust. I think it's a paper that gives you some practical tips and tools for really building these bridging relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually one I reread every year, Liz. And what I really like about it is this, the accountability. What's your personal accountability to build and extend trust first, as opposed to waiting for it to, it's on you to do. Our third guiding idea is show up vulnerable and ready to learn. And so this one was one that I thought that example from Halifax did well. But it's this acknowledgement that you will make mistakes. You have a lot to learn. It'll never be perfect. And seeking to learn from the community and also on your own. And so what does it look like to actually say, I want to talk to these groups, but I'm actually, I'm worried that I won't do it in the right way. And I think one unfortunate problem that happens, and we've seen it happen a lot around engaging Indigenous communities, is that people are fearful of doing it wrong, and so then they just don't engage. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think that you need to show up and say, I really care deeply about doing this the right way, and please help me understand how to do that. One tool that we've found a helpful framework, either literally using this framework when wanting to reflect with another group on the things that you may have done that have been offensive, or just the intent was different than the impact that it had, is this ouch, oops framework. And so what it really does is, this is an example from the LGBTQ plus community. And, an example here is that your intent in a statement might be that you want us to understand that you're on our side and that you recognize our identity. And so somebody might say something like, oh, I understand what you mean. My cousin identifies as gay. But the impact of that statement might be that people feel that they're judged the same, and that their experiences aren't unique. And that's the opposite effect of what you wanted. And so using this and saying, if you hear something that you're like, oh, was that, that didn't sound right, you can use these words like, oh, that wasn't my intent, or clarifying what was your intent. And then clearly communicating, oh, the way I heard that was this. And then you can, you can circumvent long-standing issues that may arise from, not knowing what to do and the impact being different than what you intended. And so this is a framework we've seen pulled up and, on the table with a group of people who haven't worked well together in the past, as well as just keeping the language in mind to help clarify situations as you go.
Yeah, I find this framework very interesting to read, and I think helpful. And I think, it's helpful to consider, if we don't know, consider how we ask, right? Or ask people to help us with the knowledge that they have and the perspectives that they bring. So this builds on that framework, and this is something I think we've learned at Tamarack quite a bit in terms of some of the poverty reduction work and some of the community change work that we've been engaged with. And the notion of this guiding idea is really to treat people as unique human beings. And while we might be working in a domain area, individuals within that domain area will have different journeys and different perspectives, just as we all do. And so one of the ways that we think is important in terms of this guiding idea is really to think about a set of principles. Think about the work from a set of principles perspective. And so pulled together from the American Anthropological Association, this set of principles in terms of their code of ethics. And it's interesting, right? Because in community change work, in community engagement work, you will bump up into difficult situations and difficult conversations. And so spending time early on really thinking about, okay, so what are those guiding principles that we need to be paying attention to as we do this work is really helpful. Prior to my joining Tamarack, I led the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and we were working on pretty complex issue, poverty. And one of the principles that we had was that we were a no blame, all accountable table. And that was an interesting principle because we weren't there to blame anyone. And in fact, if you looked around the table, you could voice blame on everyone, right? Whether it's individuals living in poverty, or there could be, opportunities for you to do that, or government for not supporting them, nonprofit organizations for not delivering services and programs where they were most needed, the business community for not providing the right kinds of jobs. So, it's almost like everyone around the table was both part of the problem of poverty, but more importantly, they could all be part of the solution. And so having a set of principles to drive the work really can be helpful in terms of holding the work, the engagement work in a way that kind of meets a higher standard. So I think this set of principles that we provided are really interesting, but there are lots of examples out there. This is just one of them. And when you hit that bump, what's really important is not the fact that you did principles, but bringing them forward and having a discussion about, we have this principle about no blame. How does this now inform where we are in this conversation? So it's not only writing the principles, but living up to them as well.
Mm-hmm. And writing the principles is a really good exercise to do together with the community. And so saying, all right, what's most important to us as we work together? And making sure that everybody's on board with the principles and extending that as an exercise you do together is actually a really great way to bridge and rebuild some of those relationships. The next guiding idea we have is really about thinking about the process of engagement. So our guiding ideas up until now have mostly focused on individuals and thinking about how people work with each other in relationship. And our last few are going to focus on the processes of engagement. And so when we think about what is an authentic process, we really need to understand that the community input needs to actually influence the trajectory of the project. And Michael McAfee has a really great quote that I love. He says, "The price of participation is contribution." And so we need to understand what are the benefits of engaging, what's on the table in terms of the project and what can be changed, and what's off, and how do we be incredibly transparent about that. We can't cherry pick feedback to support our ideas or the things that we're hopeful for. And one thing that I see a lot here is there's often some fear around engaging from an organizational perspective. I see this occasionally in municipal work. So, it's this idea that, we definitely need to talk to the community, but what if they want something that we can't do? And so I think there's some work that needs to be done around how do we develop trust? How do we trust the community's ideas? And how do we have these conversations in a way that's getting back to the why of why we're engaging? The there's some questions that are really helpful that you can ask yourself. And so it's around, what are the clear benefits to engagement that resonate with your audience? Have you sought to understand the harms of engagement? And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. To what extent do you personally have the ability to follow through on the outcomes? This is one that is really important. And then, so it's things like, this is something that helps with the fear. So it's things like, here's the budget, or here's what's in scope or out of scope, and making those explicit so you don't feel like you have a conversation with the community, there's high hopes, and then you have to let them down, or they're angry because, all the things that they want aren't happening. And it's because there hasn't been transparency and accountability for that follow through. And again, have similar consultations been conducted in the past, and how can you use that as a starting point? Related to the benefits, and are there harms of engagement? I don't think we often spend enough time thinking about if there's any harms. What does having these conversations do? Is it worth the time and the energy? And how do we maximize the potential benefit?
Yeah, a really interesting example is this notion in the potential harm category of weaponizing data. Some of the work that Tamarack has been involved in is around bringing communities together around place-based poverty reduction work. And early piece of that work is to do a poverty matrix. And so it's interesting that, sometimes when you do that, the data is used against certain populations or subpopulations, or it identifies, groups and does create, some ways of looking at the data where it creates more power for one group and less power for the other. That's I think how I interpret weaponizing data. There is a way to maximize potential benefit from another lens, and the Urban Institute has a really great tool called the data walk. And so this data walk is where you put up different points of data around the room. You say, what we want to do is to work on this problem together. Here are 6 or 7 pieces of data, and the community goes in together and interprets what that data means to them. And so it's less about holding the data, and saying, okay, this, it from a kind of a power perspective, but rather engaging with the data in a way that empowers people and allows them to reflect on what that point of data means to them. And so we can think about, really in concrete ways, how have we potentially harmed people in our engagement processes, and how can we shift this around to look at other ways of doing the work? And this ties into one of our final ideas, which is this idea of giving up power, right? And so it is interesting, right, to think about, even as we convene engagement sessions, we are starting to hold the power. We're starting to be the person who calls the meeting, sets the agenda, thinks about the process. And if we do some of the other things that Lisa has suggested early on, build trusted relationships, co-design it together, then those are ways that we can really begin to give up some power. The next slide that we're going to share with you is some thinking that our colleagues at Co-Creative Consulting have put together as a tool. And it's really an interesting way of thinking about agenda design, or design of sessions where we really engage in deep collaborative innovation. And they say that there should be 4 agendas or 4 approaches that you build into any kind of engagement session or any kind of learning session together. The first one is aligning. So to really be upfront about, why are we gathering together? Why are we engaging you? What's the purpose? What's the alignment? What's the end result that we're hoping for? The second is the connecting agenda. And the connecting agenda is really about being purposeful, about giving people an opportunity to meet each other, to connect across the many boundaries that are between us. And at Tamarack, that looks like asking the question, why is it important that you're here today? Or in giving people an opportunity to connect over coffee or food or some, open space for those dialogue, that other dialogue to happen. The third thing that you want to build into your agendas is learning. So again, Lisa has referred to this a little earlier, but where are the opportunities where we can give people a little bit more information about something, whether it's about engagement, whether it's about the issue that we're convening people about. So what is it, and how are we building learning into the system? And then the making is the decision making. It's about the testing of tangible solutions. And so the challenge that I would put forward to you is, how can you build all four of them into your engagement agenda process, and also how can you build them into your regular meeting process so that you can improve collaborative outcomes?
I find it so interesting to think about power, and I think this is one example that we saw in the case study for the Halifax Poverty Solution Group, and we'll share that full case study with you as well, is one of their recommendations that they called out as, we need to make sure that the person chairing all meetings or facilitating all meetings is somebody with lived experience. And if that's not possible, we need to build the capacity for that. So they've said that at the forefront, they recognize that that person who's convening that session does hold power by the fact that they're in that role. And so by handing that power and raising the voice of the person with lived experience, it's starting to balance those power differences. And just thinking about, how can you elevate the voice of the context expert? So we use these words content expert and context expert, where the content expert is somebody who's, a professional. You are likely a content expert in your field. And a context expert is somebody who deeply knows the experience that you're talking about. And so it might be somebody with lived experience of whatever that issue is. And so how do you raise their voice? Instead of talking for them, how can they speak? How can you hand over that power to them? And what are some of the engagement techniques you can do so that they're telling their own stories and you're providing the stage for that? Our last guiding idea, number 7, is working together. And so I think this comes back to this, community engagement shouldn't be an afterthought. It's not, something that we have to do in the process and we're fearful of that. And, oh, what if it takes the project off course? That can't be the perspective going into it. We need to understand that community is the solution, not the problem, and recognize that context expertise. When we think about how we're working together, if we're looking at purely consulting, we need to recognize that that's only going to take us so far. So if we think about buy-in versus ownership, buy-in is when you've generated some ideas, or you have a ultimate goal in mind, and then you're looking for the community to agree that that's a great idea, and they could shape that, but it's ultimately something that you're looking for their buy-in. Whereas ownership can only be developed if the community was involved in the process, if they helped build it. You have ownership of something that you helped to build. And so when you think about how you're engaging and the engagement strategies or processes that you're undertaking, think about co-design. Think of building things together, and instead of going to the community with some options and getting their feedback, go to the community with, hey, let's work on this problem together, and have them co-design those solutions and be heavily involved in all of the process and work together. And so it's this moving from doing for the community to doing with the community, and empowering them with the work that they're already doing, and recognizing that and elevating that work. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about on this point is really spending some time thinking about, what is your role as a facilitator. Your role typically is not to have the answers, and I think it's something that we often are conscious of or fearful of when we walk into a room, that we think the community will be looking to us as somebody who, you know, needs to know what's going to happen next, or know what the answer or expect that you have an answer. And I think if we put on that facilitator hat, we need to understand that our role is to be curious and to ask questions and ensure that all voices are heard. And I think when we put on that hat, it's much easier to have a really constructive relationship and not be fearful when we walk into those kind of situations. But that typically involves a little bit of a mindset shift in saying, hey, it's really, really important that we work together on this. And that's the positions that we want to have. So those are the 7 guiding ideas as we were thinking through, you know, how do you bridge gaps and repair relationships with groups that might have damaged relationships in the past. There might be negative past experiences. And so the challenge really is to think through, you know, what's one thing you can do? What's 2 things you can do as some of your next steps to start building relationships with your communities? And so I want to open it up to questions now. If you feel free to type them into the question box, and Duncan can share any questions with us. And also, if there's any of those, if you have some clear next steps as well as something you'd immediately want to change, or something that's been really thought-provoking for you, we'd love for you to share that as well. That would be really helpful to hear.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thanks to everyone who's submitted your questions so far. There's plenty coming in, but if you still have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box and we'd love to get to it. Our first question is from Emily. I wonder about the ethics of using engagement data from previous engagements, not done by your organization. And how do you communicate about this if that's your plan for data use in your decision making?
That's a really, really great question, Emily. I think the main intention here with the comment of asking what data is already there is making sure that you're not just asking the same questions over and over again if they've been asked in the past. And so I think it's about talking to the community to understand what is the starting point, and making sure that you have a shared starting point rather than doing it all over again. Liz, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think I would want to look at the data that came out of the previous consultation. So I agree with you, Lisa, understanding that you're not asking the same question again. Was it an authentic process? Did they connect with roughly the same audience? So I would want to look at those results before making the decision to go ahead with my engagement, or really kind of understanding, okay, what motivated them and did they engage appropriately, right? So it's really kind of spending some time looking at some of those questions before you say, oh, we don't have to engage, or our engagement would look like this. And then to be clear, when you are engaging, if you do decide to go ahead, to be clear that you have looked at that other data, but that you are engaging in this way for this purpose, right? So that people, you know, who did participate in that past process kind of know what is different about the process that you're trying to move forward in terms of engagement. So it'll look different in every kind of situation, I think, but people will ask you, or people might comment during your process, oh, I just went to something about the very same topic
Yeah.
a month ago. And so you have to be prepared to also be able to respond to that as well.
And I think it's really about the community being heard, right? And making sure that we're leveraging the resources we have in the right kind of way. So not duplicating effort. And, you know, if there are other groups who are working on similar things, how can you work together to leverage everything that you have and not have those duplicate conversations?
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. We have a question here from Lauren, and it's, do you have any strategies to effectively prioritize less dominant agencies or individuals while maintaining engagement of those who tend to be more dominant?
That's a really good question. I think you want to look at different ways in a process that people can engage. And so sometimes people just say, oh, we've heard from you. Are there other people that want to, share their ideas or their wisdom around that? And that sometimes works in certain settings. Other settings we've had where we've asked people to write their ideas down first, maybe on Post-it notes or something like that. And so everybody has then the opportunity to contribute, and you can gather them or to gather their thoughts, and then you can gather them that way. Or, you want to think about, are there multimodal ways that you can develop your engagement process that really allows people, those who want to speak, give them voice, but also allows for people who are quieter and more retrospective to also give their voice. Sometimes if it's a really quiet group, you might engage in the engagement process, but then follow up with a survey of some sort that, then allows people who've had some soak time to contribute their thoughts and ideas. So it's whatever works for you, I think.
I think for me, it's a question. One way of approaching it might be starting from a goal in mind of asking, what representation do we want? And saying, okay, what does that look like? We need to hear from, this agency and this agency and this agency, and maybe even having a principle around that, around what representation looks like from the whole group, from the wider group of agencies.
We also do have a question from Sandra. Can you speak to how to manage as a facilitator when there are different factions within the community on different sides of an issue? So how do you prioritize and manage those relationships when the community isn't one kind of homogenous group in terms of their views on the same complex problem?
That's a really good question. I think it's a fact that there'll always be different opinions, and I think thinking about that pre-engagement, and I really recommend reading that pre-engagement strategy document too, and we'll make sure to share that. Is really understanding the various layers and voices of a community, and that needs to be done in advance. And so I think just by having conversations with people who have different perspectives, I think that's an important step. And I think that you can then design processes that make sure that you're listening to all of those various groups. I think something that goes wrong is when we're not even aware that there's different opinions, because we're going to the connections that we have and not understanding all of those layers. And so just the understanding of who the people are, what are their opinions, is helpful to know, hey, we need to talk to all of these people, and we need to understand that there are those different perspectives. There's a lot of really great processes for, instead of focusing on different opinions, it's working to realizing what is the thing that you're both seeking. So kind of drilling up, I was going to say, but working up towards what is that shared goal, and then talking about, okay, what are the options, and having the conversations around, based on this shared goal, how can we achieve that together as a community?
Thanks for that, Lisa. We have two questions that are somewhat related, so I'm going to ask them back to back here. The first is from Reg. They say, I've heard from the community that they really want to be involved in the doing part. So our point where we talked about earlier, working together. But what do you do when that's not really an option? So they were thinking municipal contracts and legalities surrounding tenders and awarding contracts. The second is a question from Avril, and it relates to how this process is affected by government. So whether that's restraints and things you can and can't do while working for a municipality or provincial government, but also in general, a community's mistrust of the government.
Liz, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I think it's, we didn't include this as a slide, but we will include it as a resource. And it's the community engagement spectrum that the International Association for Public Participation uses as a guiding kind of tool, right? So it is really important along the spectrum to say, okay, so where is this engagement process landing on this spectrum, and to be clear about that. And also, I think it's important to be clear about the opportunities and the limitations related to that, right? So if, for example, on the spectrum, the work that you're doing is only about informing folks about, this change that's happening in the community, that's okay. That's legitimate that you need to inform them and people need to be better informed. But to say that you're engaging them is not necessarily the case. It's more about informing. So the spectrum, I think, is a helpful tool to consider, how your engagement process will land, and what your promise to the public is around that. And it's, I think, particularly helpful when there are some limitations on these processes, because they're convened by government, or they are part of a more political kind of process, to really understand that. The other thing I think that's helpful is to also say, we're gathering this information to inform this. We're not sure where the decision will land. This is one part of other parts of the consultative process. So if you have, multiple parts to your consultative process, and you're going out and engaging stakeholders, and then you're going to do some research, and then you're going to look at data, you want to also frame it in that way so that people know and understand, where they fit in the process, and what the overall timeline is as well for the process, and where they might look for next steps and that kind of thing. I think that's that piece that Lisa talked about, where you always want to circle back and let people know what you did with their information, but equally you want to tell them up front and be as clear up front about both the opportunities and the limitations of the engagement process that you're being involved in.
Yeah, that transparency is really key there. And I also think, when I think about the community engagement continuum, we often hear from people that they want to be engaging more deeply, but there's kind of, internal reasons that they feel they're not able to do that. And so having those conversations internally is really helpful. But we've been really inspired, by, in particular, the neighborhood sector, with pushing the limits of municipal government towards that empower type step. And so that's really where you're saying, community, you decide what's important to you, and we will go with whatever you decide. And so you see this a lot in neighborhood granting as one of the first areas that we've seen a lot of momentum pick up, where, something that was scary previously is now something that cities across Canada are doing, and the world, in funding what the community wants. And I think as we see more and more examples of that, and more creative forms of engagement, I think it will be easier in some of those municipal contexts.
And I think, just to add one more thing, Lisa, what often happens when you gather people together around an issue is, as much as you're wanting them to engage with you on the issue, sometimes they learn new things, or they make some new connections that will empower them to go out and do something on their own, right? So, there's this kind of magical thing that happens where people go, oh, I didn't know that, or we often see business cards being exchanged. And so, even though we have an outcome that we're driving towards, it's also important to think about, okay, so what are some other ways that folks might continue to ramp up their own work that they're already involved in, or, are there things that they could take away to their group? And when you think about the 4 agendas resource that we talked about, that learning piece, if you do it right in your engagement process, might be a great information tool that will motivate people to do things on their own outside of the engagement process.
Wonderful. I just wanted to thank everyone on the call for submitting your great questions. We have time, I think, for one quick question here. Which of these 7 guiding ideas or principles do you think is the most challenging, or one that you'd like to call out specifically, just for some advice on how to navigate it?
For me, it's the showing up vulnerable and ready to learn, because really we're all paid to be problem solvers. And I find myself continually having to check myself to say, okay, don't try to solve that problem. Just be ready to learn about what people's perspectives are, and and to spend some time being very thoughtful in that process. And I just want to jump in and come up with the solution. And I think that's not necessarily the way to go. It's really about listening intently and really kind of respecting the process. That for me is both challenging, but also the biggest opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo that a lot. I'll pick a different one just because I can. Mine would be design authentic processes, because I think we're always up against timelines and budgets and the way that we've always done it. And so I think when we're looking to do something different, we need to be brave, and it's kind of an uphill battle. So if you're suggesting something that's never been done, especially if you work in a situation that is more resistant to change, I think it's an uphill battle to prove why it should be done differently. But the more you can do this, I think the more benefit you'll see, and just really spending that time to go slow in designing a process that really is beneficial to the community and is deeply connected to that underlying why.
Wonderful. Thanks again to everyone for submitting your questions. I think we just have one final announcement here. Lisa, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, so we are really excited about our upcoming Community Change Festival. It's happening in Vancouver from September 30th to October 3rd, and it's featuring a keynote from George A. You are invited to come to this. We would love for you to be there, and it's all about bringing together change makers from near and far to deepen your knowledge of these 5 practices needed to move your community change agenda from idea to action to impact. You'll leave with the practical tools and resources on collective impact, community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluation, as well as incredible immersive city learning experiences and peer learning opportunities. The thing that I'm most excited for is the design of the agenda, that it's really starting at looking at what are the trends we're seeing in community change on the first day, and what are those key practices that we need to know. The second day is all about getting inspired and hearing from emerging practices as well as those immersive city experiences and seeing it in action. And the third day is about the practical tools and things that you can take home immediately for your work. And then the last day is really setting a posture of, okay, what's my role as a change maker and what are my immediate next steps? And it's also going deep into this topic of power and privilege that we were talking about with seek to give up power. And so that's something that we're kind of ending the festival with. What about you, Liz?
The whole process, the engagement of the whole process, the really learning from folks that are at the event and them sharing their best practices, but also being able to go deep on one of the topic areas. I'm leading the collaborative leadership topic area, and it's one that I've been really thinking a lot about, looking at the multiple ways that leadership expresses itself, and then what does it mean to be an effective collaborative leader. So yeah, I think it'll be a great event. Last year was a really great opportunity in Toronto to meet a lot of change makers, and I echo Lisa's invitation to you to come and share your wisdom with others and to go deeper on some of these topics.
Wonderful. So you can learn more there. The URL's there. We'll also be sending a link to that in the email that you'll get tomorrow. So that will also include a link to the recording of today's call, as well as all of the resources we've mentioned. You can always learn more about upcoming learning opportunities on our website. There's lots of free workshops, free webinars just like this one. So you can go to our website, tamarackcommunity.ca. And then we also encourage you, in just a second, we have a really short webinar survey, and we'd love to get your feedback on how you enjoyed today's session. And this link will be on your screen in just a second, as well as will be sent out in an email. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.